The castle breathed with the weight of centuries, its stone walls exhaling cold whispers that had witnessed empires rise and crumble into dust. Count Dracula stood at the window of the western tower, his pale fingers resting against the frost-covered glass, watching the moon cast silver light across the Carpathian peaks. 9 years, 3,285 nights of this exquisite torture. 3,285 sunsets, where he had watched her move through the corridors of his domain, untouchable as starlight, forbidden as paradise itself. Elena. Her name was a prayer on his lips, though he had long ago forsaken the right to pray. In the chamber below, she sat by the fireplace in the eastern wing, always the eastern wing, as far from his own quarters as the castle's architecture would allow. He could hear her breathing, steady and warm, so achingly alive. He could hear the rustle of the pages as she turned them in whatever book she had chosen from his library that evening. Gothic romances lately, stories of doomed love and tragic heroines. The irony was not lost on him. Dracula closed his eyes, and the memories rushed back unbidden as they did every night at this hour. The wedding had been in the village of Brasov 9 years ago, in the spring when the world still knew how to bloom. He had been hunting, drawn by the scent of joy and celebration, emotions that had become foreign to him, exotic as spices from distant lands. The church bells had rung out across the valley, and he had moved through the shadows like smoke, watching the festivities from the darkness he could never leave. Then he had seen her, Elena Vaduva, barely 20 years old, dressed in her grandmother's wedding gown of cream-colored lace, orange blossoms woven into her dark hair. She had been laughing at something her new husband had whispered in her ear, her face radiant with a happiness so pure it had struck him like a blade to the chest. In that moment, something within him, something he had believed dead for 300 years, had stirred with terrible aching hunger. Not hunger for her blood, though that would have been simpler, cleaner, easier to satisfy and forget. No, this was something far more dangerous. He had looked at her joy, her vitality, her absolute faith in the goodness of the world, and he had wanted to possess it, to keep it close, to understand what it meant to feel such things again, even if only through proximity to one who still could. So he had taken her, not violently. He had never laid a hand upon her, not then, not in all the years since. He had simply appeared in her bridal chamber as the church bells faded into twilight, a shadow coalescing into terrible reality. Her husband had tried to fight, of course. Dracula had left him alive, frozen by supernatural compulsion, forced to watch as the vampire lifted Elena into his arms, so careful not to let his skin touch hers, and carried her away into the night. The husband had organized search parties for months afterward. Dracula had watched them scour the forests and mountains, always coming close, but never close enough. Eventually, the man had remarried, a practical arrangement with a widow from the neighboring village. Dracula told himself he felt nothing about this. He told himself many lies. "I know you are there." Elena's voice drifted up from below, breaking his reverie. "I can feel you watching, as always." Dracula opened his eyes. 9 years, and still her voice could make him ache. "Forgive me," he said, his words carrying easily through the castle's ancient stones, pitched so she would hear him clearly, but he would not have to move closer. "It is a habit I cannot seem to break." "Habits can be broken," she replied, and he heard the rustle of fabric as she stood. "Curses perhaps cannot." She had grown bolder over the years. In the beginning she had wept and raged and begged for her freedom. Then had come the silence, weeks of it, where she refused to speak or eat or acknowledge his existence in any way. He had panicked then, terrified she would will herself to death out of sheer despair. He had sent his servant, Gregor, to tend to her, to speak with her, to convince her that survival was worth the effort. Gregor was the only one Dracula trusted within the castle walls. The old man had served him for 60 years, bound by an oath sworn in exchange for saving his daughter from plague. Unlike Dracula, Gregor could touch Elena, could bring her meals and fresh linens, could offer the simple human comfort of presence without danger. Slowly, Elena had begun to live again. She had explored the castle, discovered the library, begun to ask questions, and Dracula, starved for conversation that did not revolve around fear and servitude, had answered. They had fallen into a strange routine of distant companionship, he in his tower, she in her wing, words exchanged across stone and shadow, but never, ever within reach. "You read late tonight," Dracula observed, deflecting her comment about curses. He always deflected when she approached certain topics. I could not sleep, Elena said. I had a dream. Something in her tone made him tense. What manner of dream? There was a long pause. He heard her footsteps, soft against the ancient rugs, moving toward the center of the chamber below. She was directly beneath him now, separated by one floor of stone and timber, yet it might as well have been an ocean. I dreamed of fire, she said quietly, of men with torches and crosses coming up the mountain, led by a priest with eyes like winter. Dracula's hands curled into fists against the window frame. It was only a dream. Was it? Elena's voice sharpened. Or was it a vision? You have told me yourself that this castle holds old magic, that the stones remember and sometimes whisper their secrets. Perhaps they whispered to me. If hunters come, I will protect you, Dracula said, and the words came out more fiercely than he intended. No harm will come to you within these walls. This I swear. You swear, Elena repeated, and now he heard something new in her voice. Not fear, not anger, but something more complex, more painful. You swear to protect me, yet you are the very reason I need protection. You took me from my life, from my husband, from everything I knew, and you imprisoned me in this beautiful, terrible place. And for what? What do you want from me, Dracula? If you wished to drink my blood, you would have done so years ago. If you wish to make me like you, you have had countless opportunities. So what is it? What am I to you? The question hung in the air between them, and for a long moment Dracula could not answer. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? How could he tell her that every night he stood at this window, his hands aching with the need to touch her, to feel the warmth of living skin against his own, knowing that such contact would poison her beyond any cure, that he kept her here because sending her away would be like ripping out what remained of his heart, yet keeping her was a cruelty he could not justify. You are, he began, then stopped, started again. You remind me of what I was. Before you became a monster, before I became nothing, he corrected softly. There is a difference. Elena was quiet for a long time. Then, I do not think you are nothing. If you were nothing, you would not stand at your window every night watching over me. If you were nothing, you would not maintain this distance between us. Monsters take what they want without thought or care. You are not doing that. You defend me? Disbelief colored his words. After everything I have done to you? I do not defend your actions, Elena said, but I am beginning to understand them. 9 years is a long time, Dracula. Long enough to see beyond the monster. Long enough to recognize suffering when it stands outside my door, night after night, wanting something it can never have. Her words struck him like holy water, burning and purifying at once. How had she seen through him so clearly? How had she understood what he himself had barely admitted in the darkest hours before dawn? The distance between us must remain, Dracula said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. It is not cruelty, Elena. It is the only kindness I have left to offer you. Why? The question was gentle but insistent. You have never told me why. What would happen if you touched me? If we... She trailed off, as if the rest was too dangerous to speak aloud. Dracula pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his reflection ghostly and indistinct in the moonlight. There is a curse, he said finally, older than my transformation, woven into the very essence of what I am. If I were to touch you, truly touch you skin to skin, my nature would corrupt you. Not by making you vampire, but something worse. The touch would be poison, Elena. It would burn through your veins like acid, destroying you from within. You would die in agony, and I would be forced to watch, unable to end your suffering, unable to take it back. He heard her sharp intake of breath. How do you know this? Because it has happened before, Dracula said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Long ago, before I learned to keep my distance, before I understood the price of reaching for what I desire. The silence that followed was heavy with questions she did not ask, and he was grateful for her restraint. He could not speak of Elisabetta. Not yet. Not when the wound was still raw after all these centuries. His first love, his mortal wife, the woman who had died in his arms when he forgot himself for one moment, one terrible moment, and reached for her hand in the darkness. Then, you have been alone all this time, Elena said softly. Truly alone. No touch, no closeness, no comfort. For 300 years. It is no less than I deserve. Perhaps, Elena said, or perhaps it is far more than any being deserves, no matter their crimes. Dracula lifted his head sharply. Was that pity in her voice? After everything he had done to her, did she dare to feel compassion for him? The thought was absurd, offensive, and yet it warmed something in the frozen wasteland of his chest that he had thought long dead. You should sleep, he said, retreating from the conversation before it could undo him completely. Dawn is still hours away, but you are mortal. You need rest. And you? Elena asked. What will you do until dawn? What I always do, Dracula said. I will stand here and I will watch over you and I will remember what it means to want something I cannot have. He heard her sigh, a sound so achingly human it made his chest constrict. Good night, Dracula. Good night, Elena. Her footsteps retreated, moving toward the bedchamber that Gregor had prepared for her years ago. Dracula listened until he heard the rustle of sheets, the settling of her body into the bed, the gradual slowing of her breathing as sleep claimed her. Only then did he allow himself to close his eyes and remember. The memory rose unbidden, sharp and merciless as broken glass. Elisabetta, his wife, his love, his damnation. She had been the daughter of a minor nobleman, beautiful and kind, with hair like midnight and eyes that held all the warmth the world could offer. He had been human then, merely a count, a warrior returned from fighting the Turks. Their marriage had been arranged, but love had bloomed quickly between them, genuine and deep. Then had come the betrayal, the false letter claiming he had died in battle. Elisabetta, overcome with grief, had thrown herself from the castle walls into the river far below. When he returned days later, victorious but too late, he had found her broken body on the rocks, her blood painting the stones red. His rage had been absolute. He had renounced God, renounced heaven, cursed the forces that had stolen her from him, and something ancient and dark had answered that curse. A creature of the night had come to him, offering power, offering immortality, offering revenge against a world that would dare to take his love away. He had accepted. He had drunk deeply from the vampire's veins and felt his humanity burn away like morning mist, replaced by something cold and eternal and hungry. But the curse had not ended there. The dark forces he had bargained with had been crueler than he could have imagined. They had brought Elisabetta back, restored her to life in his very arms as he lay dying and transforming. He had reached for her in joy and desperation, not yet understanding what he had become. His touch had killed her. Again. He had watched the light leave her eyes a second time, had felt her skin blister and burn beneath his fingers, had heard her screams echo through the castle until they faded into the most terrible silence he had ever known. The curse was complete. He could have immortality. He could have power. He could have everything, except the one thing he truly wanted, the ability to touch another living soul without destroying it. For 3 centuries, he had walked the earth alone, keeping his distance from all mortal things, until that spring evening 9 years ago, when he had seen Elena in her wedding gown and made the most selfish decision of his long, cursed existence. He had taken her not to kill her, not to transform her, but simply to keep her near, to hear a human voice that did not scream in terror, to remember what it felt like to want to reach out, even knowing he never could. It was torture, exquisite and unending, but it was also the closest thing to feeling alive that he had experienced since Elisabetta's second death. Elena did not know any of this. He had told her about the curse, about the danger of his touch, but he had never spoken of Elisabetta. He had never explained that she was living in the shadow of a ghost, that every time he looked at her, he saw the woman he had lost and the man he used to be. Perhaps that made him even more of a monster than she realized. A sound broke through his thoughts, footsteps, heavy and purposeful, climbing the tower stairs. Gregor. The old servant moved slowly these days, his joints stiff with age, but he still maintained the castle with dedication that bordered on devotion. "Master," Gregor said, as he emerged onto the tower landing, slightly breathless from the climb, "forgive the intrusion at this hour." "What is it?" Dracula asked without turning from the window. His eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains, but his attention was entirely on the servant. "News from the village," Gregor said, and there was something in his tone that made Dracula's hands tighten on the window frame. "There is talk of a priest. Father Constantine, they call him. He has been preaching about the demon in the mountains, about the bride who was stolen 9 years past." Dracula's eyes narrowed. "There have always been such rumors." "This is different, Master," Gregor continued. "This priest, he claims to have ancient texts, rituals that can destroy even the oldest of your kind. He is gathering men, blessing weapons, preparing an assault on the castle." "Let them come," Dracula said coldly. "None have succeeded in 300 years. This priest will be no different." "Master," Gregor's voice dropped lower. "The Lady Elena spoke of a dream tonight, of fire and crosses, of a priest with eyes like winter. Dracula turned sharply to face the old servant. "She told you this?" "No," Gregor admitted, "but I heard her speaking with you through the stones, and I—" He hesitated, then pressed on. "I have seen this priest, master, in the village, when I went for supplies. His eyes are indeed cold, like winter ice, and there is a madness in them, a zealotry that will not be turned aside by fear or reason." A chill ran through Dracula, not from cold. He had not felt cold in centuries, but from something deeper, more primal, foreboding. "When?" he asked. 3 days, perhaps 4, Gregor said. "That is what the villagers whisper. They speak of it like an army preparing for battle, with blessing of weapons and final confessions. This Father Constantine has convinced them that they fight for God himself." Dracula turned back to the window, his mind racing. 3 or 4 days, not much time. He could fortify the castle, prepare defenses, ensure that no mortal force could breach his walls. He had done so before, many times. The castle had stood against armies. It would stand against a mob of zealots led by a mad priest. But Elena's dream troubled him. The castle's magic did indeed run deep, and it did sometimes show visions to those sensitive enough to perceive them. If she had dreamed of the coming attack, what else had she seen? What else had the stones whispered to her in the darkness? "Gregor," Dracula said quietly, "I want you to prepare supplies, food, water, medicine, enough for several weeks. Store them in the eastern wing where the lady resides. You expect a siege, master?" "I expect nothing," Dracula said, "but I will not risk her safety. No matter what comes, no matter what these hunters bring against us, she must be protected." "Of course, master," Gregor said, bowing, but he did not leave immediately. After a moment's hesitation, he spoke again. "Master, forgive me, but I must ask. 9 years you have kept her here. 9 years of this distance. Is this truly how you wish to continue? Forever watching, never touching, forever wanting what you cannot have?" "It is the only way," Dracula said firmly. "But is it a life?" Gregor pressed gently. "For either of you." "It is all I can offer," Dracula said, his voice hardening. "Now go. Prepare the supplies. We have little time." Gregor bowed again and retreated, his footsteps fading down the stairs. Dracula remained at the window, watching the moon track its slow path across the sky, illuminating the mountains in cold silver light. 3 days, perhaps 4. He thought of Elena, sleeping peacefully in her chamber below, unaware of the danger gathering in the valley. He thought of Father Constantine and his zealots, armed with faith and fury and ancient texts. He thought of Elisabetta, dead in his arms, her skin blistering beneath his desperate touch. The distance between them must remain. No matter what came, no matter what he wanted, it was the only kindness he had left to offer, the only way to keep her safe from the monster he had become, even if it meant watching her from afar for eternity, never able to cross the space between them, never able to offer the comfort of a simple touch, a hand held in darkness, an embrace that spoke of protection and belonging. Better the ache of separation than the agony of loss. Better the torture of distance than the horror of watching her die in his arms, as Elisabetta had, destroyed by the very love that should have saved her. The moon continued its journey across the sky, indifferent to his pain, and Dracula stood vigil at his window, watching over the one thing in 3 centuries that had made him remember what it meant to be human. Even if he could never touch her, even if the distance between them could never be bridged. Even if this exquisite torture would last until the sun finally burned away the darkness and reduced him to nothing but ash and memory. In the chamber below, Elena stirred in her sleep, murmuring words he could not quite hear. He leaned forward, straining to catch them, and his heart, if such a dead thing could be said to have a heart, constricted when he finally made them out. "Please," she whispered, lost in dreams. "Please, just once, let me feel." She did not finish the thought, but she did not need to. Dracula closed his eyes against the pain of understanding, of wanting the same impossible thing, and he remained at his window until the first grey light of dawn forced him to retreat into the darkness of his tower, where the sun could not reach him, and the weight of his curse could press down upon him in the solitude he deserved. Father Constantine knelt before the altar in the village church of Brasov, his weathered hands clasped so tightly around his rosary that the wooden beads bit into his flesh. He welcomed the pain. It was a reminder that he was still human, still mortal, still capable of feeling something other than the cold fury that had consumed him for the past 9 years. 9 years since the demon had stolen Elena Vaduva from her wedding night. 9 years since God had given him this sacred mission. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in fragments of crimson and gold. It should have been beautiful. Once, before his calling, he might have found it so. But beauty was a distraction, a temptation, a veil the devil used to hide the corruption beneath. Father Constantine had trained himself to see past such things, to perceive the truth that lay beyond the world's pleasant surfaces. And the truth was simple. Evil walked the mountains and it had to be destroyed. "Father," a voice interrupted his prayers. Young Stefan, the blacksmith's son, stood at the entrance to the sanctuary, his cap twisted nervously in his hands. "The men are gathered. They await your blessing." Constantine rose from his knees, his joints cracking with the movement. He was not an old man, barely past 40, but the years of his crusade had aged him in ways that went beyond the physical. His hair, once dark, was now threaded with grey. His face, once open and kind, had hardened into something carved from marble, expressionless and cold. "I will come," he said, his voice carrying no warmth, no reassurance. He had learned long ago that comfort was not what men needed when facing demons. They needed certainty. They needed righteousness. They needed to believe that God stood with them, even when they walked into darkness. Stefan nodded and retreated. Constantine took a moment to gaze up at the crucifix above the altar, at the suffering Christ with his crown of thorns and his wounds that bled eternal forgiveness. "Give me strength," Constantine whispered. "Give me the will to do what must be done, and if I should fall in this task, let my death serve your purpose." He crossed himself, then turned and walked down the aisle toward the heavy wooden doors. His footsteps echoed in the empty church, a lonely sound that seemed to emphasize his isolation. The other priests thought him mad. The bishop had tried to reassign him, to send him to a monastery where his obsession could be contained and forgotten, but Constantine had refused. He had proof now, evidence that could not be denied, and he would see this through to the end. Outside, 30 men waited in the churchyard, their faces grim with determination and fear. They were farmers and craftsmen, husbands and fathers, men who had never held weapons with intent to kill, but each of them had lost something to the darkness in the mountains. A daughter who vanished, a son who never returned from the forest, a wife found drained of blood on the side of the road. The demon had taken from all of them, and now they would take their vengeance. Constantine surveyed them with his cold gaze, noting who stood straight and who trembled, who met his eyes and who looked away. Fear was natural, fear was human, but it had to be controlled, channeled into purpose. "Brothers," he began, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade, "you have come here today not as farmers or craftsmen, but as soldiers of God. You have answered his call to cleanse the corruption from our land, to destroy the demon that has plagued us for too long." Several men crossed themselves. Others gripped their weapons, axes, hammers, sharpened stakes, crude crosses fashioned from blessed silver. They were not an army, not in any traditional sense, but faith could be stronger than steel, and righteousness could pierce where swords could not. "Some of you may doubt," Constantine continued, pacing before them like a general before battle. "Some of you may wonder if we have the strength to face such evil. But I tell you this, God does not call the equipped, he equips the called. You are here because he has chosen you. You are here because you have the courage to stand against the darkness." "But Father," a voice called out. It was Mihai, the cooper, his face pale despite the morning sun. "They say the demon is ancient, powerful beyond measure. They say he has stood against armies. How can we hope to succeed where others have failed? Because we have what they did not," Constantine said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age. The Testament of St. Methodius, lost for centuries, now found. Within these pages are the rituals and rites to bind even the oldest vampires, to render their power meaningless, to expose them to the purifying light of God's judgment. He held the book aloft, and the men leaned forward, drawn by the promise it represented. Constantine had spent 3 years tracking down this text, following whispers and legends from monastery to monastery, finally discovering it in a sealed vault beneath a ruined church in the mountains of Bulgaria. The moment he had opened it, had read the ancient words written in Latin and older tongues, he had known his quest was not in vain. "The ritual requires 3 elements," Constantine explained, lowering the book. "Holy water blessed at midnight under a new moon, which I have prepared. Salt from the tears of widows who have lost their husbands to evil, which you have provided. and the blood of a willing sacrifice given freely in the name of righteousness. A murmur ran through the crowd. The blood requirement was new information, something Constantine had kept from them until this moment. "Whose blood, Father?" Stefan asked quietly. Constantine met the young man's eyes. "Mine." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Several men protested, claiming they could not ask their priest to make such a sacrifice, but Constantine raised his hand for silence. "It must be freely given by one who serves God," he said, "and I have made my peace with this. If my blood is the price of destroying the demon, if my death is required to free the innocent woman he holds captive, then it is a price I pay gladly." He did not tell them the whole truth, that the ritual required not just blood, but a life, that the binding would hold only as long as the sacrifice's heart continued to beat, growing weaker with each moment until it finally stopped, that he expected to survive the assault on the castle only long enough to see the demon destroyed before his own death claimed him. They did not need to know. They needed to believe in victory, in the possibility of returning to their homes and families. Constantine had no such illusions. He had known from the moment he found the testament that this quest would end in his death. He accepted it as he accepted all of God's will, without question, without hesitation, without fear. "When do we march, Father?" Mihai asked. "Tomorrow at dusk," Constantine replied. "The demon is weakest in the hours between day and night, when the sun has set, but darkness has not yet claimed full dominion. We will approach the castle from the eastern side, where the walls are oldest and the protections weakest. The ritual must be performed in the courtyard, within sight of the demon himself." "And the woman?" another voice asked. "Elena Vaduva. What of her?" For the first time something flickered in Constantine's expression, not warmth but a shadow of what might have been regret. "If she lives, we will free her. If she has been turned, if she has become one of the damned—" He let the implication finish itself. "She was a good woman," Stefan said quietly, "pure-hearted. She did not deserve what happened to her." "None of them deserved it," Constantine agreed. "Which is why we must act. Evil, unchecked, spreads like plague. The demon must be stopped whatever the cost." He dismissed the men with instructions to prepare themselves, to make peace with their families, to confess their sins, to ready their souls for what was to come. As they dispersed, Constantine remained in the churchyard, the testament clutched to his chest, his eyes turned toward the distant mountains, where Castle Dracula loomed like a cancer against the sky. He had not always been this way. Once he had been a different kind of priest, gentle, compassionate, focused on comfort rather than crusade. He had tended his flock with kindness, had counseled lovers and baptized children, had found joy in the simple work of shepherding souls. Then Sister Maria had disappeared. She had been young, barely 20, with dreams of becoming a missionary. She had taken her vows with radiant faith, had worked in the village orphanage, had brought light wherever she went. Constantine had thought of her as a daughter, had guided her spiritual development with pride and affection. One night, she had vanished from the convent. No trace, no sign of struggle, simply gone. The other sisters claimed they had heard nothing, seen nothing, but Constantine had known. He had felt the presence of evil in the air, had sensed the corruption that had stolen her away. He had found her body 3 days later in the forest, drained of blood, her eyes frozen open in an expression of terror that would haunt him until his dying day. The puncture wounds on her neck left no doubt as to what had killed her. That was when his transformation had begun. That was when he had set aside comfort and compassion and embraced the cold fury that would sustain him through the years of searching, studying, preparing. He had traced the pattern of disappearances across the region, had interviewed survivors, had collected evidence that all pointed to one source, the vampire in the mountains, the ancient demon who called himself Count Dracula. The Elena Vaduva case had merely confirmed what he already knew. The demon had grown bold, stealing a bride on her wedding night, keeping her imprisoned in his castle for purposes Constantine did not want to imagine. It was an outrage that demanded response, a sin that cried out to heaven for justice. And Constantine would be the instrument of that justice, even if it cost him everything. He walked back into the church, past the pews where his congregation gathered for Sunday Mass, past the confessional where he heard their sins and offered absolution, back to the small room behind the sanctuary that served as his study. The walls were covered with maps and notes, years of research documenting the vampire's movements and victims. In the center of the room stood a table bearing the implements of the ritual, vials of holy water, pouches of widow's salt, the ancient silver chalice that would hold his blood. And there, propped against the wall, was his greatest treasure and his heaviest burden, a stake carved from the wood of a tree that had been struck by lightning, blessed by 3 bishops, and inscribed with prayers in 7 languages. According to the Testament, such a stake could pierce even the oldest vampire's heart, could hold him long enough for the purifying fire to finish the work. Constantine ran his fingers along the inscribed wood, feeling the power that thrummed within it. Tomorrow he would carry this into the demon's lair. Tomorrow he would face the evil that had plagued his region for too long. Tomorrow he would sacrifice himself to save the innocent. "Sister Maria," he whispered to the empty room, "I have not forgotten you. I will never forget you, and I will avenge you. I swear it on the blood of Christ." A knock at the door interrupted his prayer. He turned to find Father Andre, the elder priest, who had tried so many times to dissuade him from this path, standing in the doorway with concern etched deep into his lined face. "Constantine," the old priest said gently, "there is still time to reconsider. The bishop has agreed to send experienced hunters, men trained in fighting such creatures. You do not need to do this yourself." "Yes, I do," Constantine replied flatly. "This is my calling, my purpose. Everything I have done for the past 9 years has led to this moment." "And what of your flock?" Father Andre pressed. "What of the people who depend on you? Who will guide them when you are gone?" "You will," Constantine said, "as you did before I came here. You are a good priest, Andre. Kind, compassionate, everything a shepherd should be. But I am not that man anymore. I am a weapon, forged by grief and tempered by purpose, and weapons have only one use." Father Andre shook his head sadly. "You speak of yourself as though you are already dead." "I have been dead for 9 years, Constantine said quietly. "Since the moment I found Sister Maria in the forest. Since the moment I understood that evil was not an abstract concept to be debated in seminary, but a real, tangible force that destroys innocent lives. I buried my old self with her, Andre. What stands before you now is merely the instrument of God's justice." "Justice?" Father Andre's voice rose slightly, unusual for the normally gentle man. "Or vengeance? Can you truly say your heart is pure in this, that you act from righteousness and not from rage?" Constantine turned away, unable to meet the old priest's knowing gaze. "Does it matter? The demon must be destroyed. The woman must be freed. If my motivations are impure, then I will answer for that when I stand before God. But the work will be done." "Constantine," Father Andre said softly, stepping into the room, "I know you are in pain. I know you blame yourself for not protecting Maria, but throwing your life away will not bring her back. It will not heal the wound in your soul." "I do not seek healing," Constantine said, his voice hard as stone. "I seek completion. This is what I was meant to do. This is why God allowed me to find the Testament, why he has brought me to this moment. Everything else, the doubt, the pain, the loss, is merely the price of serving his will." Father Andre was silent for a long moment, studying the younger priest with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Finally he sighed. "Then I will pray for you, brother. I will pray that God grants you the strength to do what you believe is right, and the wisdom to see beyond your anger to the truth." "Thank you," Constantine said, though he did not believe prayer would change anything. His path was set. The outcome was inevitable. By this time tomorrow, either the demon would be destroyed or Constantine would be dead. Perhaps both. Most likely both. Father Andre left, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. Constantine remained in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his obsession, the tools of his coming sacrifice. He picked up the chalice that would hold his blood, feeling its weight, its significance. In his mind, he rehearsed the ritual once more. The words in Latin and Greek and the older tongue that predated both. The gestures that would draw the binding circle. The moment when he would cut his palm and let his blood flow into the chalice, mixing with the holy water and widow's salt. The final prayer that would invoke God's power to hold the demon, to strip away his unholy protections, to render him vulnerable to the stake and the fire. It would work. It had to work. He had given up everything for this. His peace, his gentleness, his hope of redemption. He had become the very thing he once would have counseled against, a man consumed by a single purpose, unable to see beyond his need for vengeance disguised as justice. But perhaps that was what fighting evil required. Perhaps to destroy a monster, one had to become monstrous oneself. If that was the price, Constantine had already paid it. There was no going back to who he had been, no reclaiming the innocent faith he had possessed before Sister Maria's death. He was Father Constantine, the priest with winter eyes, and tomorrow he would bring the cold judgment of God to the demon in the mountains, or he would die trying. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Constantine knelt once more before his makeshift altar. The testament opened before him, and he prayed not for victory or survival, but for the strength to complete his mission regardless of the cost. In the mountains above, in the castle that had stood for centuries, Count Dracula stood at his window and watched the distant village, aware without knowing specific details that something was coming, that the peace of 9 years was about to shatter, and that the distance he had maintained for so long would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. And between them, the pawn in a game neither fully understood, Elena woke from troubled dreams of fire and blood and winter eyes, with the certainty that everything was about to change. The storm was gathering, the players were taking their positions, and the tragedy that had been set in motion 9 years ago was finally approaching its terrible conclusion. Tomorrow, at dusk, the priest and the demon would meet. One believed he served God. The other knew he served nothing but his own cursed existence. But both understood that when the sun set on the following day, one of them would be destroyed. Neither understood that the true cost would be measured not in the deaths of monsters or martyrs, but in the heart of the woman who had been imprisoned between them, the innocent maiden who had learned to see humanity in a creature that had forgotten what it meant to be human, and who would soon be forced to choose between the freedom she had been denied and the monster she had come to understand. The pieces were in place, the ritual was prepared, the hunters were ready, and Count Dracula, standing at his window, closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Forgive me, Elena, for everything that is about to happen, for bringing you into this, for keeping you here, for wanting so desperately to reach across the distance between us, even knowing I never can." She did not hear him. She was 3 floors below, staring at the ceiling of her chamber, wondering why her heart raced with anticipation and dread, why she felt the weight of something enormous and terrible approaching like a storm over the mountains. But somewhere in the stones of the ancient castle, in the magic that had seeped into every mortar and beam over centuries of darkness and longing, her thoughts and his merged for just a moment, and they both understood the same truth. The distance between them, which had seemed eternal and unchangeable, was about to be shattered. Whether by death or by something even more dangerous, connection, neither could say. But change was coming, riding on the righteous fury of a priest with winter eyes and a heart full of rage disguised as devotion, carrying with him the power to destroy or to damn, and believing without question that he alone knew the difference between the two. Elena stood in the library, her fingers trailing across the spines of ancient books, each one a window into a world she could no longer reach. 9 years she had lived within these walls, 9 years of marble floors and velvet curtains, and the oppressive weight of beauty that felt more like a gilded cage with each passing day. The library had become her sanctuary, the one place where she could lose herself in other lives, other stories, other prisons, that at least had the decency to end on the final page. Outside the tall windows, the sun was setting, painting the Carpathian peaks in shades of amber and blood. She watched the light fade as she did every evening, knowing that when darkness fell completely, he would emerge from wherever he spent his daylight hours. He would take his position at his window in the western tower, and he would watch her, always watching, never touching, never closer than the length of a corridor or the height of a floor. For 9 years. She pulled a book from the shelf without looking at the title, then settled into the leather chair by the fireplace, where Gregor had already built up the flames against the evening chill. The old servant was the only person besides Dracula who ever spoke to her, and even those conversations were brief, careful, as though he feared saying too much would somehow betray his master. Elena opened the book and found herself staring at a volume of poetry, Romanian verses from centuries past, filled with longing and loss and the particular melancholy that seemed to seep from the very soil of this land. She read a few lines, but the words blurred before her eyes, her mind too restless to focus. The dream from the previous night still haunted her, fire and crosses and winter eyes, men coming up the mountain with murder in their hearts and righteousness on their lips. She had told Dracula about it, had felt his reaction even through the stone and distance, the tension, the fear he tried to hide, the protective fury that made her chest ache with a confusion she did not want to examine too closely. Why did she care if he was afraid? Why did his pain matter to her? He had stolen her from her wedding night, had imprisoned her in this castle, had kept her from her family and the life she should have lived. She should hate him. She had hated him in those first terrible months when grief and rage had been her only companions. But time had a way of eroding certainty and proximity. Even the strange, distant proximity they shared had a way of revealing truths she wished could remain hidden. He was not simply a monster, or rather, he was a monster who remembered being human, and that memory tormented him in ways she was only beginning to understand. "My lady," Gregor's voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. "Forgive me, but I must ask, are you well? You seem troubled." Elena closed the book, setting it aside. "I cannot stop thinking about the dream, about what might be coming." Gregor stepped into the room, his movements slow and careful, as they always were. He carried himself like a man who understood he was allowed in her presence only at his master's sufferance, though Elena had never seen Dracula treat him with anything but respect. "The master is preparing defenses," Gregor said. "He will not let harm come to you." "I know," Elena said quietly, "but at what cost? If men come here, if they attack, people will die. Mortal men with families, with lives. And for what? To rescue me from a prison I—" She stopped, uncertain how to finish that sentence. "A prison you what, my lady?" Gregor prompted gently. Elena looked away, fixing her gaze on the fire. "Their prison I am no longer certain I want to leave," she admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal even as she spoke them. "What does that make me, Gregor? What kind of person becomes comfortable in captivity?" The old servant was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was kind but firm. "It makes you human, my lady. Humans adapt. We find ways to survive, to make meaning even in the darkest circumstances. There is no shame in that." "But my husband," Elena began. "Has remarried," Gregor finished gently. 5 years ago to a widow from the neighboring village. They have 2 children now, from what I hear in the market. He mourned you truly, but life moves forward for the living. It must." Elena felt the words like a physical blow, even though she had suspected as much. Of course her husband had moved on. Of course he had built a new life. What else could he have done? And yet, hearing it confirmed made something twist in her chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a strange sense of disconnection, as though the woman who had stood in that church 9 years ago wearing orange blossoms in her hair had died that night, and Elena was merely a ghost haunting these halls. "Does he know I still live?" she asked. "There are rumors," Gregor said carefully, "but no proof. The village believes you are dead, taken by a demon and surely devoured or turned. In a way, perhaps they are right. The woman you were cannot return to that life. Too much has changed." "Because of him," Elena said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only statement of fact. "Because Dracula decided he wanted me here and nothing else mattered." "Yes," Gregor agreed. "My master is many things, but selfless is not among them, though I think—" He hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue. "I think he punishes himself more harshly than you could ever punish him. The distance he maintains, the refusal to touch you, it is agony for him, my lady. Every night, every moment. He chose this torture willingly to protect you from his curse." "I know about the curse," Elena said. "He told me. His touch would poison me, burn me from within. But Gregor—" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He has never told me why. How did he become this way? What happened to make him into whatever he is?" Gregor's expression grew guarded. "That is not my story to tell, my lady. If you wish to know the master's history, you must ask him yourself." "I have tried," Elena said, frustration bleeding into her tone, but he deflects, changes the subject, retreats into silence. "How can I understand him if he will not let me see who he truly is?" "Perhaps," Gregor said slowly, "he is afraid that if you truly saw him, not the monster, not the lord of this castle, but the man beneath all that, you would find something too broken to bear looking at." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Helena thought of the nights she had heard him pacing in his tower, of the times she had caught glimpses of his face when he thought she was not looking, and seen such naked longing there, it had made her breath catch. She thought of his voice in the darkness, admitting that she reminded him of what he had been before he became nothing. "I do not think he is broken beyond repair," Elena said quietly. "I think he is broken, and trying very hard to remain so because he believes it is what he deserves." Gregor smiled sadly. "You see clearly, my lady, more clearly than he suspects, I think. But be careful. Seeing clearly can be dangerous, especially when the thing you see is something you might want to reach for. I would not, Elena said quickly, too quickly. I know better than to… I understand the situation. The distance must remain, for both our sakes. But even as she spoke the words, she remembered the dream from the night before. Not just the fire and the crosses, but the moment before she woke, the image that had lingered at the edges of her consciousness. Dracula, reaching for her, his hand extended, his face twisted with desperate need, and she reaching back, knowing it would destroy her, not caring. It had only been a dream. But dreams, she was learning, often told truths that waking minds refused to acknowledge. Gregor, she said suddenly, if the hunters come, if they somehow succeed in getting past the defenses, what will happen to me? The old servant's face grew grave. The master will protect you with everything he has, even if it costs him his existence. Of that, I am certain. But what if I do not want that? Elena asked, surprising herself with the question. What if I would rather… She stopped, unable to finish the thought, uncertain what she actually wanted. Freedom. After 9 years, did she even remember what freedom felt like? To return to a village where she would be seen as either a ghost or a victim, to a husband who had moved on, to a life that no longer had room for who she had become, or to stay in this castle, in this beautiful prison, forever separated from the one being who truly saw her, who spoke to her as an equal, who had given her access to knowledge and conversation, denied to most women of her station, even if he could never. Give her the simple comfort of a hand held in darkness. My lady? Gregor's concerned voice brought her back to the present. You look pale. Should I bring you wine? Food? No, Elena said, standing abruptly. I think I need air. I will walk in the eastern courtyard. Gregor bowed and retreated, leaving Elena alone with her tumultuous thoughts. She walked through the corridors of the castle, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and forgotten kings. Everything in this place spoke of permanence, of time measured in centuries rather than years. It made her mortal life feel insignificant, a brief candle flame in an eternal darkness. She emerged into the eastern courtyard, where a fountain stood silent in the center, its water stilled by winter's approach. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, cold and distant and beautiful. Elena wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tilted her head back, breathing in the crisp mountain air. You should not be out here. Dracula's voice came from above, and she was not surprised. She had known he would be watching, as he always was. It is growing cold. You will catch ill. Then perhaps you should have stolen me in summer, Elena replied, her tone sharper than she intended. Or perhaps you should not have stolen me at all. There was a long silence. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, laden with something that might have been regret. You are right, of course. I should not have taken you. It was selfish, cruel, indefensible. If I could undo it, if I could return to you that night and make a different choice. He trailed off, and Elena could hear the weight of 9 years in that unfinished sentence. But you cannot, Elena said, not asking, simply stating fact. So here we are, you in your tower, me in your courtyard, and between us this unbridgeable distance that you insist must remain. It must, Dracula said, and there was steel beneath the sorrow now. Elena, you must understand. I understand that you are afraid, Elena interrupted, turning to look up at the tower where she knew he stood, though she could not see him in the darkness. I understand that something happened, something terrible, that made you believe you can never be close to anyone again. But Dracula, is this truly living, for either of us? This eternal watching, this careful distance, is this all we are meant to have? It is all I can offer, he said, his voice rough. It is all that is safe. Safe, Elena repeated, and she laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even herself. I am a prisoner in a vampire's castle, and you speak to me of safety. I am watched over by a creature that could kill me in a heartbeat, that drinks blood to survive, that is hunted by every moral man with courage enough to climb this mountain. Where exactly is the safety in any of this? I would never harm you, Dracula said, and there was such fierce conviction in his words that Elena felt her breath catch. I would destroy myself before I allowed any injury to come to you. Surely you know that by now. I do, Elena admitted, but do you not see that is not safety, Dracula? That is just another form of prison. You keep yourself locked away from me, locked away from any possibility of connection or comfort, because you are so terrified of causing harm that you cannot see you are causing a different kind of harm through your absence. Better absent than destructive, Dracula said. Better distant than deadly. Elena crossed her arms. frustration and something else, something she did not want to name, rising in her chest. And what of what I want? Do I have no say in this? You took my choice away when you stole me from my wedding. Will you take it away again by refusing to even consider that there might be another way? There is no other way, Dracula said, and now she heard desperation beneath the steel. Elena, please, you do not understand what you are asking. The curse? Then explain it to me. Elena's voice rose, echoing off the courtyard walls. Stop hiding behind vague warnings and distant concern and tell me what actually happened. Who was she? The woman you touched before you learned to keep your distance. The silence that followed was so absolute that Elena wondered if he had left, if her pushing had finally driven him away. But then, so quietly she almost missed it, she heard him speak. Her name was Elisabetta. Elena waited, hardly daring to breathe, sensing she was finally about to hear the truth that lay at the heart of everything. She was my wife, Dracula continued, each word seeming to cost him something. My mortal wife before I became this. We were happy, or as happy as one could be in times of constant war. She was gentle, kind, full of light. Everything I no longer am. What happened to her? Elena asked gently. Betrayal happened, Dracula said, and the pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. False news of my death in battle. She believed I was gone, and in her grief, she threw herself from the castle walls. When I returned, victorious but too late, I found her body broken on the rocks below. Elena's hand went to her mouth, horror and sympathy warring within her. I renounced God that day, Dracula continued. I renounced heaven, renounced every good and decent thing, and I called out to the darkness for the power to take revenge on a world that would allow such injustice. And the darkness answered. A creature came to me, offered me immortality, offered me power beyond imagining. I accepted without hesitation. And the curse, Elena whispered. The curse was the price, Dracula said bitterly. As I lay dying, transforming into what I am now, Elisabetta was restored to life. Some twisted mercy from the forces I had bargained with, returning to me what I had lost. She was in my arms, alive again, and I reached for her in joy and relief, not yet understanding what I had become. He stopped, and Elena could hear him struggling to continue. My touch killed her, he finally said, killed her for the second time. I watched the light leave her eyes again, felt her skin blister and burn beneath my fingers, heard her scream my name in agony and betrayal. The curse was complete. I could have power, immortality, everything, except the one thing I truly wanted, the ability to hold the woman I loved without destroying her. Tears were streaming down Elena's face now, though she made no sound. She understood finally the depths of his torment, the reason he stood at his window night after night, watching but never approaching, wanting but never reaching. For 300 years, I have kept this distance, Dracula said. I have touched no one, allowed no one close, because I cannot watch someone die in my arms again. Do you understand now, Elena? Do you see why I cannot give you what you are asking for? I see, Elena said, her voice thick with tears. I see your pain. I see your fear. But Dracula, I also see a man who has been punishing himself for 3 centuries for a choice made in grief and desperation. How long will you wear this curse? How long will you deny yourself and anyone who might care for you, even the smallest comfort, because you are so afraid of repeating a tragedy that might not repeat at all? It will repeat, Dracula said, with absolute certainty. The curse is not a threat, Elena, it is a fact. My nature is poison to the living. There is no cure, no remedy, no escape from what I am. Elena wiped her eyes, drawing in a shaky breath. She thought of her dream, of reaching for him despite knowing the danger. She thought of the hunters coming up the mountain armed with righteousness and ancient rituals. She thought of 9 years in this castle, learning his moods through the thickness of walls, coming to know him through conversations conducted across empty space, and she realized something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She did not want to leave. She did not want to be rescued by Father Constantine and his zealots. She wanted to stay here in this castle with this broken, cursed creature who watched over her with such desperate longing. He did not know she could feel it in every stone of the building, but she could not say that. Not yet. Not when she was still trying to understand what it meant, what it would cost. The hunters are coming, she said instead, changing the subject to safer ground. What will you do? I will protect you, Dracula said immediately. I will do whatever is necessary to ensure no harm comes to you. Even if that means killing men who believe they are saving me? The silence was her answer. They think they are righteous, Elena said quietly. They think they are saving an innocent woman from a demon. They do not know that the innocent woman has learned to see humanity in the demon, that she has come to understand his suffering, that she stopped, unable to finish. That she what? Dracula prompted, and she heard something new in his voice. Hope, fragile and tentative, like the first shoots of spring after a long winter. That she no longer knows what she wants, Elena admitted, except that she does not want anyone to die for her sake. Not you, not the hunters, not anyone. I cannot promise that, Dracula said. If they come for you, if they threaten you, I will destroy them. I will burn the world before I let harm come to you. Why? Elena asked, the question bursting from her before she could stop it. Why do I matter so much to you? You have countless victims, countless people whose lives you have taken or destroyed over 3 centuries. Why am I different? Why do you care whether I live or die? The silence stretched so long she thought he would not answer. Then so quietly she had to strain to hear it. Because when I look at you, I remember what it was like to be human, to want something beyond blood and survival and the endless tedium of immortality. You are not Elisabetta, Elena. You are yourself, entirely and completely. But you make me remember that I was once a man who loved deeply enough to damn his own soul, and perhaps in some twisted way, protecting you is the only form of redemption left to me. Elena's chest tightened, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it from his tower. She wanted to say something, to respond to that raw confession with honesty of her own. But before she could find the words, Gregor appeared in the courtyard entrance, his face pale with urgency. Master, he called up to the tower. My lady, you must both come inside. I have news from the village. Dracula appeared at the courtyard entrance so quickly Elena gasped, though she should have been accustomed to his supernatural speed by now. In the torchlight, she could see his face properly for the first time that evening, pale as alabaster, inhumanly beautiful, with eyes that burned with intelligence and something darker, something hungry and ancient and terrifying. And yet, she was not afraid. She should have been, but she was not. What news? Dracula demanded, his attention on Gregor. The priest, Father Constantine, Gregor said, breathless. He marches tonight, not tomorrow, as we believed. He gathers his men even now. They will be at the castle gates within 2 hours. The blood drained from Elena's face. 2 hours. Not enough time to prepare, to fortify, to do whatever Dracula had planned. Get her to the inner chamber, Dracula ordered Gregor, the one with the iron door. Lock her in and do not open it for anyone but me. Do you understand? Yes, master, Gregor said, bowing. Wait, Elena protested. You cannot simply lock me away while you face them alone. I can and I will, Dracula said, and his voice was pure command now, the voice of a lord who had ruled for centuries and expected absolute obedience. You will not be harmed, Elena. Whatever else happens tonight, you will survive. That is all that matters. No, Elena said, surprising herself with her vehemence. No, it is not all that matters. Dracula, please. But he was already moving, already turning away, already preparing for the battle to come. Gregor took Elena's arm gently but firmly, guiding her back inside the castle, and she let herself be led even as her mind raced with everything she wanted to say, everything she needed to tell him before it was too late. The last thing she saw before Gregor closed the courtyard door was Dracula standing alone in the darkness, his face tilted toward the mountain path where torches were beginning to appear in the distance, growing closer with every moment. And she understood, with sudden, terrible clarity, that tonight would change everything. Tonight, the distance between them would either be shattered or made eternal. Tonight, someone would die. And Elena, locked away in an iron room while the battle raged outside, would be powerless to stop it. The hunters were coming, and the vampire, who had learned to love through watching from afar, was preparing to kill to protect the one thing that made his cursed existence bearable. In the village church, Father Constantine lifted the stake blessed by 3 bishops and began his final prayers. In the castle, Dracula stood at the gates and remembered what it felt like to be mortal, to fear, to love something enough that losing it would destroy him more completely than any stake or fire ever could. And between them, locked in an iron room, Elena pressed her hands against the cold metal and whispered into the darkness, Please, please do not make me choose between my freedom and your life. Please do not make me watch you die for me. But the stones of the castle, which had witnessed 3 centuries of lonely vigil, offered no answer. The torches were drawing closer. The storm had finally arrived. The iron door was 3 inches thick, forged in an age when men still believed cold iron could bind demons and keep evil at bay. Elena pressed her hands against its surface, feeling the chill seep through her palms, and listened to the sounds of battle filtering through the ancient stones. Shouting, the clash of metal, screams of pain and fury, and underneath it all a sound she had never heard before but recognized instantly, Dracula's voice, raised not in the measured tones she knew from their distant conversations, but in raw, primal rage. She had asked Gregor to stay with her, but the old servant had refused, his loyalty to his master overriding his duty to comfort her. He had locked the door from the outside and taken the key, and Elena had heard his footsteps retreating down the corridor toward the battle, toward whatever terrible scene was unfolding in the castle's entrance hall. She was alone. Alone in a windowless room lit by a single candle, surrounded by stone walls that had witnessed centuries of violence and would witness more before this night was through. The room contained nothing but a narrow bed and a wooden chair, the accommodations of a prison cell, rather than a chamber in a nobleman's castle. But then, that was what this had always been, was it not? A prison, no matter how beautiful the rest of the castle might be, a cage lined with velvet and filled with books, but a cage nonetheless. And yet, as she pressed her ear to the door and heard another crash, another scream, she felt no relief at the thought of rescue. She felt only terror, not for herself but for him, for the monster who had stolen her and kept her, and watched over her with such careful, aching distance for 9 years, for the man who had loved so deeply he damned his own soul, and had been punishing himself ever since. For Dracula, the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Somewhere in the past 9 years, in the countless conversations conducted across stone and shadow, in the slow revelation of his humanity buried beneath centuries of curse and isolation, she had stopped seeing him as her captor. She had begun to see him as something else entirely, something she did not have a name for, something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Elena pulled away from the door and paced the small room, her mind racing. She thought of Father Constantine and his holy warriors, armed with righteousness and ancient rituals. She thought of Dracula facing them alone, protecting her even as she sat locked away, useless, unable to even bear witness to whatever sacrifice he was about to make. She thought of his confession in the courtyard, of the raw pain in his voice when he had spoken of Elisabetta. "Because when I look at you, I remember what it was like to be human." The words echoed in her mind, and she understood finally what she had been too afraid to admit even to herself. She did not want to be rescued. She wanted him to survive. And if that made her mad, if that made her as cursed as he was, then so be it. Another crash, closer now, and then a sound that made her blood run cold. Father Constantine's voice, raised in Latin, chanting words that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the castle. She did not understand the language, but she felt the power in it, felt the way the air itself seemed to contract and shudder with each syllable. A binding ritual. The words from her dream came back to her with terrible clarity. The priest, with winter eyes, armed with ancient texts, with rituals that could destroy even the oldest vampires. "No," Elena whispered, pressing her hands against the door again. "No, please, no." She pulled at the handle, knowing it was futile, that the lock would not yield to mere desperation. But she pulled anyway, her fingers aching, her breath coming in gasps. She could not simply stand here. She could not be locked away while he faced destruction on her behalf. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and she heard Dracula cry out, not in rage this time, but in pain, a sound of pure agony that drove a spike through her heart. "Dracula!" she screamed, pounding on the iron door with both fists. "Dracula!" No answer, just the continued chanting, and beneath it, the horrible silence where his voice should have been. Elena stepped back from the door, her mind working frantically. Iron could bind demons, the old story said, but she was not a demon. She was mortal, human, and there had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do. Her eyes fell on the candle, its flame dancing in the still air of the chamber. Fire. She could set fire to the wooden chair, create smoke, force someone to open the door. But what then? The battle was already underway. By the time anyone noticed smoke from this room, it might already be over. She needed something faster. Her gaze moved to the walls, searching for any weakness, any crack in the ancient stone. And then she saw it. In the far corner near the ceiling, a gap between stones where the mortar had crumbled with age. It was small, barely large enough for her to fit her hand through, but it opened onto the corridor beyond. Elena dragged the chair to the corner and climbed onto it, stretching up to reach the gap. Her fingers found the edges of the loose stone, and she pulled, ignoring the way the rough surface cut into her skin. The stone shifted slightly, grinding against its neighbors. She pulled harder, desperation lending her strength she did not know she possessed. The stone came free with a shower of dust and mortar, and she nearly fell from the chair with the sudden release. She caught herself, breathing hard, and looked at the gap she had created. It was larger now, perhaps 8 inches across, running up into the darkness above. Not large enough for her to fit through, but possibly large enough for her voice to carry more clearly. She pressed her mouth to the opening and called out, "Gregor, Gregor, please, I need you." No response. The old servant was elsewhere, perhaps fighting alongside his master, perhaps already fallen. Elena refused to think about that possibility. She tried again. "Anyone, can anyone hear me, please?" Silence, broken only by the distant sounds of battle and that terrible rhythmic chanting that made her teeth ache and her skin crawl. Elena climbed down from the chair, her mind racing through possibilities. She could not break down the door. She could not fit through the gap in the wall. She could not... Wait. She looked at the gap again, at the way the darkness seemed to extend upward rather than outward. Not a gap leading to the corridor, but a gap leading to a space between the walls. An air shaft, perhaps, or a remnant of older construction, the kind of hidden spaces that riddled ancient buildings like this. If she could remove more stones, could widen the gap enough to climb into that space, she might be able to move through the walls themselves, might find another way out. It was desperate. It was dangerous. The whole thing could collapse on her. But sitting here while Dracula died was not an option she could accept. Elena climbed back onto the chair and began pulling at the stones around the gap, working with frantic determination. Her fingernails broke and bled. Dust filled her lungs, making her cough, but stone by stone the opening grew wider. Below, in the great entrance hall of the castle, Father Constantine stood in the center of a circle drawn in salt and holy water, the testament open before him on a pedium of blessed silver. Around him his men held torches and weapons, their faces grim with determination and fear. And before them, held in place by invisible bonds, Count Dracula struggled against the power of the binding ritual. Constantine had not expected the demon to be so strong. He had read the accounts, had studied the descriptions of vampire power, but reading was not the same as experiencing. When they had first breached the castle gates, surprisingly easy, as if the demon had been distracted, and entered the hall, Dracula had moved like lightning, faster than mortal eye could follow. 3 men had fallen in the first moments, their throats torn out before they could even scream. Then Constantine had begun the chanting, had activated the binding circle, and the demon had been caught. Now he stood trapped 10 feet from the circle's edge, his body rigid with the effort of fighting against bonds that could not be broken by physical strength alone. "You dare," Dracula snarled, his voice barely human, his eyes blazing with inhuman fury. "You dare to enter my home, to threaten what is mine, what you have stolen," Constantine corrected coldly, not pausing in his chanting. The ritual required continuous recitation to maintain its power, but he had trained himself to speak in 2 registers, the Latin prayers and the mortal conversation. "The woman you kidnapped, the innocent you imprisoned, we come to free her and to end your reign of terror." "She is safe," Dracula said, and even through the inhuman rage, Constantine heard something else. Desperation, fear, not for himself, but for another. "Whatever you do to me, she is protected. You cannot reach her." "We will find her," Constantine said. "After you are destroyed, we will search every room of this cursed castle until we find where you have hidden her." "No," Dracula said, and now his voice dropped lower, became almost pleading. "You do not understand. She must not be disturbed. She must remain locked away until dawn, until you are gone, until you can reclaim her," Constantine interrupted. "Until you can continue your unholy possession of an innocent soul? No, demon. Tonight your crimes end." He reached for the blessed stake that lay on the pedium beside the testament, its wood inscribed with prayers in 7 languages. This was the moment he had prepared for, trained for, sacrificed everything for. He would step to the edge of the binding circle, would drive the stake through the demon's heart, and would finally avenge Sister Maria and all the others who had suffered at this creature's hands. But as Constantine's fingers closed around the stake, Dracula did something unexpected. He stopped fighting. His body, which had been straining against the invisible bonds with supernatural strength, suddenly went still. His eyes, blazing with inhuman fury, closed. And when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost human. "If you mean to kill me," Dracula said, "then do so. I will not fight you any more. But I beg you, as one man to another, whatever I may have become, do not harm her. Elena has done nothing to deserve your judgment. She is innocent in all of this." Constantine faltered, the stake halfway lifted from the podium. He had expected rage, expected the demon to fight until its last breath. He had not expected this sudden surrender, this plea for mercy, not for itself, but for another. "You dare to speak of innocence?" Constantine asked, his voice harder now, defensive against the doubt that was beginning to creep into his certainty. "To you who have murdered countless innocents over 3 centuries. "I do not deny my crimes," Dracula said, opening his eyes, and for just a moment, Constantine saw something in those eyes that shook him, not the inhuman hunger of a vampire, but genuine human suffering. "I am damned beyond any hope of redemption, but Elena, she has been my prisoner, yes, but I have never harmed her, never touched her, never taken a drop of her blood. She is as pure now as the night I took her, and she deserves to live freely, whatever you may believe of me." "Then why take her at all?" Constantine demanded. "Why steal her from her wedding? Imprison her here, if not to corrupt or destroy her?" Dracula was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Constantine had to strain to hear it over the crackling of torches. "Because I was lonely," the vampire admitted. "Because for 300 years I have been alone, untouchable, separated from all human connection by a curse I brought upon myself. And when I saw her joy and her light, I wanted to keep it near me, not to destroy it, but to remember what it meant to be human. It was selfish, it was cruel, it was unforgivable, but it was not evil in the way you imagine. It was desperation, given form." Constantine's hand tightened on the stake. This was not how it was supposed to go. The demon was supposed to be a monster, pure and simple, something that could be destroyed without doubt or hesitation. It was not supposed to speak of loneliness and desperation. It was not supposed to sound like a man confessing his sins. "You are trying to manipulate me," Constantine said, forcing steel back into his voice. "Demons are masters of deception. You say what you think will spare your existence." "No," Dracula said simply. "I say what is true, because I am weary of lies. Kill me if you must, priest. I will not stop you. But before you do, I ask you to consider. What will you tell Elena when you find her locked in that iron room? What will you say when she asks what happened to me?" "I will tell her she is free," Constantine said, "that the demon who held her captive is destroyed." "And will that bring her comfort?" Dracula asked. "Or will it break her heart?" The question hung in the air like a blade, and Constantine felt something cold settle in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean that in 9 years many things can change," Dracula said quietly. "I mean that captivity and care are not always as distinct as you might believe. I mean that you should ask Elena herself what she wants before you assume you are rescuing her." "Lies," Constantine said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You have corrupted her, made her believe she cares for her captor. Stockholm Syndrome, the scholars call it." "Perhaps," Dracula conceded. "Or perhaps she has simply learned to see past what I am to who I was, and who I might still be if I were not so broken. But you will never know unless you ask her. And you cannot ask her if you kill me first, because she will never forgive you for it." Constantine's hand trembled on the stake. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Where was the battle he had expected? Where was the desperate fight between good and evil? Why did the demon speak with such resigned acceptance, such weary honesty? "You seek to confuse me," Constantine said, his voice rising, "to delay the moment of your judgment. But I will not be swayed. I have my mission. I have my purpose." "Yes," Dracula said, and now there was something like pity in his voice. "I can see that. You wear your purpose like armor, priest. You hide behind your righteousness because without it, you would have to face the pain beneath. Who did you lose? Who died that made you into this?" Constantine's face went white, then red with fury. "Do not presume to know me, demon." "But I do know you," Dracula said softly, "because I was you once, a man consumed by grief, by rage, by the need for vengeance disguised as justice. I know what it means to give everything to a single purpose, because the alternative is to feel the full weight of loss. I know because I have been wearing that armor for 300 years, and it has made me into something barely human. Do not make the same mistake, priest. Do not let your grief turn you into a monster while you hunt monsters." "Enough!" Constantine shouted, and the word echoed through the hall. He lifted the stake high, ready to drive it into the demon's heart, ready to end this confusion and doubt and do what he had come here to do. But before he could take the step that would bring him to the edge of the binding circle, a voice rang out from the balcony above. "Stop!" Every head turned. Constantine's eyes widened in shock. Elena Vaduva stood on the second-floor balcony, her dress torn and dusty, her hands bleeding, her hair wild around her face. She must have climbed through the walls themselves to escape the iron room, and now she stood above them all, her eyes fixed not on Constantine, not on the men who had come to rescue her, but on Dracula. "Elena," Dracula breathed, and for the first time since the binding had taken hold, he struggled against it again, trying to move toward her, trying to reach her. "You should not be here. It is not safe. Nothing about any of this is safe," Elena interrupted, her voice shaking but determined. "But I will not hide in a locked room while men kill each other over me. I will not be silent while my fate is decided by others." She turned her gaze to Father Constantine, and he was struck by the strength in her eyes, the absolute conviction. "You came here to rescue me," Elena said, "to free me from the demon who stole me from my wedding night. And I thank you for your courage, truly. But Father Constantine," she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, "I do not wish to be rescued." The words fell like stones into water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled men. Several crossed themselves, others gripped their weapons tighter, as if Elena's words proved she had been corrupted beyond redemption. Constantine felt the ground shift beneath him, felt his certainty crack like ice over deep water. "I do not know what you are saying," he said, his voice strained. "He has twisted your mind, made you believe you care for him. This is the demon's influence, not your true will." "How do you know what my true will is?" Elena asked, and there was steel in her tone now. "You do not know me, Father. You have never spoken to me, never asked me what I want. You simply decided what was best for me, and came with fire and stakes and holy words to enforce your decision." "He is a demon," Constantine said, as if this explained everything. "A creature of evil. He drinks blood to survive. He has killed countless innocents over centuries. You cannot possibly—" "I know what he is," Elena interrupted. "I have lived in this castle for 9 years. I have had ample time to understand exactly what Count Dracula is and what he has done. And yes, he took me from my wedding night. Yes, he imprisoned me here. Yes, he has committed terrible acts. But do you know what else he has done?" She waited, and when Constantine did not answer, she continued. "He has kept his distance from me. For 9 years, he has never once laid a hand on me. He has given me the freedom of the castle, access to knowledge most women are denied, treated me as an equal in conversation rather than a possession to be used. He has watched over me with a devotion that borders on worship, asking nothing in return, content simply to exist in my presence from afar." "Because he fears his own nature," Constantine said. "Because even a demon can be afraid of what it might do." "No," Elena said firmly. "Because he has learned from his mistakes, because he understands the cost of his touch, because he chooses every night to suffer the agony of wanting what he cannot have rather than risk harming me. That is not the behavior of a mindless monster, Father. That is the behavior of someone trying desperately to be better than his nature." Dracula was staring up at her with an expression Constantine could not read, shock perhaps or disbelief that she was defending him, that she understood what he had been trying so hard to hide. "Elena," Dracula said, his voice rough with emotion, "you do not have to do this. Let them do what they came to do. You can be free." "I do not want to be free if freedom means watching you die," Elena said, and now tears were streaming down her face. "Do you understand, Dracula? I do not want to return to a village that has forgotten me, to a husband who has remarried, to a life that no longer exists. I want to stay here, in this castle, with you, even if we can never be closer than we are now, because this strange, distant companionship we have built is more real than anything I had before you took me." The admission hung in the air, impossible and true. Constantine felt his world tilting, felt every certainty he had built his crusade upon beginning to crumble. This was not how it was supposed to go. The innocent victim was supposed to be grateful for rescue, was supposed to celebrate the death of her captor. She was not supposed to love him. "You are confused," Constantine said, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "You have been isolated too long, have begun to see your prison as home." I am not confused, Elena said firmly. I am seeing clearly for the first time in 9 years. And I am telling you, Father Constantine, that if you kill him, you are not freeing me. You are destroying the one thing in this world that makes me feel seen, understood, valued for more than my purity or my potential as a wife and mother. You are killing the man who learned to love through watching from afar, who has given me more respect in his careful distance than any mortal man ever gave me in all my years of freedom. Constantine looked around at his men, saw doubt on their faces, saw weapons lowering, saw certainty giving way to confusion. They had come here to fight a demon, to rescue an innocent, but the demon had surrendered, and the innocent was refusing rescue. What was the purpose of his crusade if the victim did not want to be saved? This is madness, Constantine whispered, though he was not sure if he was speaking to Elena or to himself. You cannot love a vampire. You cannot choose captivity over freedom. It goes against everything natural, everything holy. Does it? Elena asked. Or does it go against your assumptions about what love should look like, what choices are acceptable for a woman to make? I am not asking for your approval, Father Constantine. I am simply telling you the truth, and the truth is that I choose to stay. Even knowing what he is? Constantine demanded, his voice breaking. Even knowing he will outlive you by centuries, that you will grow old and die while he remains unchanged? Yes, Elena said simply, even knowing all of that, because whatever time I have, I would rather spend it here, with him, than anywhere else. Dracula made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and Constantine saw tears on the vampire's face, actual tears, sliding down his pale cheeks. You are a fool, Dracula told Elena, but his voice was full of wonder rather than criticism. A beautiful, brave, impossible fool. Then we are well matched, Elena replied, smiling through her tears, because what could be more foolish than a vampire who falls in love with a mortal and refuses to touch her for fear of causing harm? The words fell into silence, and Constantine felt his hand open, felt the blessed stake fall from his grip and clatter on the stone floor. He had failed. 9 years of preparation, of study, of sacrifice, and he had failed, because the demon had already been defeated, not by stakes or rituals, but by something far more powerful and far more unexpected: love. Constantine looked at the testament lying open before him, at the words of binding and destruction, and he understood finally that they were useless here. You could not destroy something that had already transformed itself through suffering and sacrifice. You could not kill what was already learning to live again. Release him, Constantine said quietly. Father? Stefan stepped forward, confusion on his young face. But the mission is over, Constantine said, his voice heavy with defeat and something else. Relief, perhaps, or acceptance. We came to save a woman who does not want to be saved. We came to destroy a demon who has already been destroyed by his own conscience. There is nothing for us here. He stepped to the edge of the binding circle and spoke the words of release, the counterprayer that would break the ritual's power. As the last syllable left his lips, Dracula stumbled forward, the invisible bonds suddenly gone. For a moment, the vampire stood frozen, as if he could not quite believe he was free. Then his eyes moved to the balcony, to Elena, and Constantine saw naked longing on his face, saw him take a step toward the stairs before catching himself, remembering the distance that must remain. Go, Constantine said to his men, all of you, we are leaving. But father, Mihai protested. Now, Constantine said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. The men hesitated, then slowly began to file out, taking their torches and their weapons and their confusion with them. Constantine remained, his eyes moving between the vampire and the woman on the balcony, between the impossible distance and the impossible love that somehow bridged it. I was wrong, Constantine admitted, the words tasting like ash. I thought I was fighting evil, but I was really fighting the possibility that evil could be redeemed, that monsters could learn to be human again, and that, he paused, struggling with the admission, that threatened everything I believed about my own mission, my own purpose. Sister Maria, Dracula said quietly, and Constantine's head snapped up in shock. The young nun who vanished 9 years ago. She was dear to you. How did you know? Constantine whispered. Because I recognize grief when I see it, Dracula said, and I recognize the need to transform that grief into something purposeful, something that feels like justice, but is really just vengeance with a holier name. I did the same thing 300 years ago, and it destroyed me. Constantine felt tears burning in his eyes, felt the armor he had worn for so long finally cracking completely. "Did you kill her?" "No," Dracula said firmly. "I have killed many in my long existence, but not her. Whoever took Sister Maria, it was not I." Constantine nodded, not certain if he believed it, not certain it even mattered anymore. His crusade was over. His purpose was gone. And he was left standing in a demon's castle, feeling more lost than he had since the morning he found Maria's body in the forest. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I will continue as I have," Dracula said. "I will watch over Elena from a distance. I will give her what small comfort I can without risking her safety, and I will try every night to be worthy of the gift she has given me, the gift of seeing me as something more than a monster." Constantine looked up at Elena, saw her watching Dracula with eyes full of love and sorrow and acceptance. "You will never be able to touch her," he said, and it was not a threat, but a simple observation. "You will spend whatever time you have together, separated by this distance. Is that truly living?" "It is more than I deserve," Dracula said quietly, "and it is everything I need." Constantine nodded slowly, then turned to leave, but at the doorway he paused and looked back. "I will not return," he said, "and I will tell the village that Elena Vaduva died tonight, consumed by the demon before we could save her. Let them hold a funeral, let them mourn, and let them forget. It is the only mercy I can offer you both." "Thank you," Elena said from the balcony, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the hall. Constantine left without another word, walking out of the castle and into the cold mountain night, where his men waited with their torches and their confusion and their questions he would never fully answer. Behind him, in the great hall, Dracula and Elena remained separated by distance. She on the balcony, he below, but connected by something stronger than any physical touch could ever be. "You should not have done that," Dracula said finally, his voice rough. "You should have let them take you. You could have been free." "I told you," Elena said gently. "I do not want freedom if it means losing you. This is my choice, Dracula. My choice to stay. My choice to love you despite everything. My choice to accept the distance between us as the price of keeping you in my life." "You deserve so much more," Dracula said, and his voice broke on the words. "Perhaps," Elena agreed, "but this is what I want. And for the first time in my life, someone is actually listening to what I want instead of deciding for me." Dracula laughed then, a sound of pure wonder and disbelief and joy, and Elena laughed too, both of them caught in the absurdity and beauty of this impossible situation. The hunters were gone. The distance remained. But everything had changed, because now they both knew the truth, that the space between them was not a barrier but a bridge, that their love existed not despite the distance but through it, that sometimes the greatest intimacy comes from the choice to stay close even when touch is impossible. In the courtyard, as Constantine and his men descended the mountain path, the priest looked back one last time at the castle silhouetted against the stars. He had come here to destroy a demon. Instead, he had witnessed something far more powerful and far more frightening than any vampire he could have imagined. He had witnessed redemption, and it had shattered everything he thought he knew about good and evil, about monsters and men, about the possibility of love in the darkest places. Father Constantine walked back to his village, back to his church, and he knew he would never be the same. Neither would Count Dracula, neither would Elena Vaduva. The distance between them remained, but the chains that had bound them, chains of guilt, of grief, of assumed roles and expected outcomes, had finally been broken, and in the breaking something new had been born, something neither of them fully understood yet, but both were willing to explore one careful, distant moment at a time. 3 months had passed since the night Father Constantine and his hunters had walked away from Castle Dracula, leaving behind their torches and their certainty and their righteous purpose. 3 months since Elena had stood on the balcony and chosen captivity over freedom, love over safety, the impossible distance over a return to a life that no longer existed. 3 months, and everything had changed while remaining exactly the same. Elena stood at the window of her chamber in the eastern wing, watching the first snow of winter fall across the mountain peaks. The flakes drifted down in the moonlight, each one a tiny fragment of eternity, beautiful and cold and ephemeral, like her own life, she thought, beautiful and brief and melting away even as it fell. She was mortal. He was not. That truth had always existed between them, but now, after her declaration before the hunters, it seemed to press more heavily on both their minds. Every conversation carried the weight of limited time, every night together, spent in their separate chambers, their words traveling through stone, held the knowledge that this could not last forever, that she would age and sicken and eventually die while he remained unchanged. And yet, she did not regret her choice. Not for a single moment. Behind her, the door opened softly. Elena turned to find Gregor entering with her evening meal, his weathered face creasing into a gentle smile. "Good evening, my lady," he said, setting the tray on the small table near the fire. "Cook has made your favorite tonight, chicken with herbs and fresh bread." "Thank you, Gregor," Elena said, moving away from the window. But she did not sit immediately, her mind still caught in the melancholy thoughts that had plagued her all day. "You seem troubled," Gregor observed, his voice kind. In the 3 months since the attack, he had become more than a servant to her. He had become something close to a friend, one of the few people in this world who understood the strange, impossible situation she had chosen. "I was thinking about time," Elena admitted, settling into the chair, "about how quickly it passes for some of us, and how slowly for others." Gregor nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. "The master thinks of this also, more than you might realize." "Does he speak of it to you?" Elena asked. "Not in words," Gregor said carefully, "but I have served him for 60 years, my lady. I know his moods, his fears, and I can tell you that since that night 3 months ago, when you chose to stay, he has been both happier and more despairing than I have ever seen him. Happy because you chose him. Despairing because he knows your time is limited, and there is nothing he can do to change that." Elena picked at the food on her plate, her appetite suddenly gone. "Sometimes I wonder if I was selfish," she said quietly, "choosing to stay here, knowing it would bring him pain when I die?" Gregor finished gently when she could not. "My lady, we all die. That is the nature of mortality. The only question is whether we live before we do so, whether we spend our brief time pursuing joy or merely avoiding pain. You have chosen to live, to love, despite the constraints. That is not selfish. That is brave." "But what will happen to him?" Elena asked, and now her voice broke slightly. "When I am gone, when he is alone again, when he has had this taste of companionship and then loses it, will he survive it, or will it destroy what remains of his humanity?" Gregor was quiet for a long moment, his old eyes distant with thought. "I do not know," he admitted finally, "but I believe that loving you, even at the cost of losing you, is better than 300 more years of isolation. You have given him something precious, my lady. You have reminded him what it means to care for someone beyond himself. That gift does not end with your death. It transforms him permanently." Elena nodded, wanting to believe it, but the fear remained. She had seen how deeply Dracula felt things, how his emotions ran like underground rivers, powerful and hidden, and occasionally breaking through to the surface with devastating force. What would happen when she was gone? Would he retreat back into the cold, distant creature he had been before she arrived? Or would he do something worse? Would he finally, after centuries of restraint, stop fighting his nature and become the monster he always feared he was? "You should eat," Gregor said, gently gesturing to the plate. "The master will be watching soon, and he worries when you do not take proper care of yourself." Elena smiled despite her dark thoughts. It was true. Dracula noticed everything. If she slept poorly, if she seemed sad, if she left food uneaten. He could not touch her, could not comfort her physically, but he found other ways to show his care. Books appeared in the library that matched her interests. The fire in her chamber was always built up before she arrived. Fresh flowers materialized on her windowsill, even in winter when such things should be impossible to obtain. She forced herself to eat a few bites, enough to satisfy Gregor, and the old servant nodded with approval before collecting the tray and departing. Elena remained by the fire, staring into the flames, until she heard the voice she had been waiting for, the voice that had become the rhythm of her nights. "Elena." It came from above, from his chamber in the tower, pitched so she would hear but need not strain. "Are you well this evening?" "I am," she called back, though it was only a partial truth. "Are you?" A pause, longer than usual. Then, "I am thoughtful tonight, reflective. The snow has begun." "I saw," Elena said. "It is beautiful." "Yes," Dracula agreed, "but it also marks the passage of another year, another season turning, another reminder that time moves forward, whether we wish it to or not." Elena closed her eyes, hearing the pain beneath his words. They were thinking the same thoughts, feeling the same fears. How many more winters would they share? How many more conversations across the distance? The unknown was a weight that pressed on both of them. "Dracula," she said carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you regret it?" Elena asked. My choice to stay. Would you rather I had gone with the hunters, so you would not have to face losing me when my time comes? The silence that followed was so long she began to fear she had overstepped, had asked something too painful to answer. But finally his voice came, rough with emotion. Every day, he admitted, I regret putting you in a position where you had to make such a choice. I regret that my selfishness 9 years ago led to this situation. But Elena, I could never regret knowing you. I could never regret these conversations, this strange companionship we have built, even knowing the pain that will come, even knowing I will have to watch you age and fade while I remain frozen in this cursed state. I would not trade a single moment of this for another 300 years of isolation. Elena felt tears burning in her eyes. I feel the same, she whispered, but I fear for you. I fear what my death will do to you. Do not fear for me, Dracula said, though his voice betrayed the lie. I have survived worse than loss. I will survive this too. Will you? Elena asked. Or will you simply endure, which is not the same thing at all? No answer came, and Elena knew she had touched the heart of his fear, the question he asked himself in the darkest hours before dawn. She stood and walked to the center of her chamber, directly below where she knew he stood in his tower. I wish, she said, her voice cracking, I wish I could touch you just once, just to feel your hand in mine, to know what it is to be held by you, even if it killed me, even if I had only moments after. I think I would choose it. No, Dracula said sharply, and she heard him move, heard his footsteps pacing above. Do not say such things. Do not even think them. Elena, I could not survive watching you die in my arms. I could not endure that again. The distance, the aching, the wanting. It is torture, yes, but it is bearable because you live, because you breathe, because every night I can hear your voice and know you are safe. Do not ask me to risk that. I am not asking, Elena said quietly. I am simply being honest about what I want, what I will always want, even knowing it is impossible. She heard him stop pacing, heard the ragged breath he did not need, but took anyway out of habit or emotion, or the ghost of his lost humanity. I want it too, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Every night I stand here watching you, wanting nothing more than to cross the distance between us, to feel your skin beneath my fingers, to hold you close and know what it means to touch another living soul. But I cannot. I will not. Because loving you means protecting you, even from myself, especially from myself. Elena nodded, though he could not see it, and wiped her eyes. This was their reality. This was the price of their impossible love. Eternal longing, eternal separation, eternal aching for something that could never be. The night continued as all their nights did. They spoke of books and philosophy and the small details of their days. They shared thoughts and feelings, and the kind of intimacy that needed no physical touch to be profound. And when the hours grew late and Elena began to yawn, Dracula bid her good night and she retired to her bed, as always, sleeping alone in her chamber, while he remained in his tower, watching over her in the darkness. But that night, Elena could not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the canopy above her bed, thinking about time and mortality, and the unbearable brevity of human life. In 60 years, perhaps less, she would be dead, an eye blink in Dracula's existence, a brief moment of light in his eternal darkness, and then he would be alone again for another 300 years, another 1,000, forever. The thought was unbearable. She rose from bed and moved to her writing desk, where she kept paper and ink for the journal she had been maintaining. But tonight she did not write in the journal. Instead, she wrote a letter to be found after her death, to be read when she was no longer there to speak the words herself. My dearest Dracula, she began, and the words flowed from her pen like water, like blood, like tears. She wrote of her love for him, of her gratitude for the strange, beautiful life they had shared. She wrote of her fears for his future, her hopes that he would find peace after she was gone. She wrote of the wish that had consumed her, to touch him just once, even knowing the cost, and her understanding of why it could never be. And at the end she wrote, Do not let my death turn you back into the creature you were before. Do not let grief consume you as it did 300 years ago. Live, Dracula. Find meaning beyond me. And remember that love is not diminished by ending, but made more precious by its brevity. I will love you until my last breath and whatever comes after. Your Elena. She folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and placed it in the hidden drawer of her desk where she kept her most precious possessions. Someday Gregor would find it. Someday it would reach Dracula when she could no longer speak. But for now it was simply a weight lifted, a truth recorded, a message sent to a future she would never see. Elena returned to bed and finally slept, though her dreams were troubled by visions of time passing, of seasons turning, of growing old, while he remained unchanged. The weeks continued. Winter deepened, locking the castle in snow and ice. Elena and Dracula maintained their routine, conversations through stone, careful distance, the aching tenderness of love expressed through words rather than touch. But Elena noticed changes in herself as the cold months wore on. She tired more easily. Her appetite diminished. She grew pale despite the roaring fires Gregor built in every room she frequented. At first, she dismissed it as the natural effects of winter, of being trapped indoors, of the melancholy that had settled over her since her conversation with Dracula about time and mortality. But as the weeks turned to months, as spring approached and she did not improve, she began to suspect something worse. Gregor noticed too. He began watching her with increasing concern, bringing her tonics and soups and urging her to eat more, rest more, take better care of herself. But nothing seemed to help. The weakness grew, subtle but persistent, like a shadow lengthening across her life. She said nothing to Dracula. She could not bear to worry him, to add to his burdens, to make him watch helplessly as whatever was happening to her ran its course. So she hid it as best she could, forcing energy into her voice during their conversations, dismissing his concerns when he noticed her coughing or her pallor. But one night in early spring, as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the courtyard garden, Elena collapsed. She had been walking to the library, moving slowly but steadily, when suddenly her legs simply gave out. She fell to the marble floor with a cry, unable to rise, her vision swimming with darkness at the edges. Gregor found her there moments later and immediately sent for a doctor from the village, an old woman who asked no questions about the castle or its inhabitants, who came with her herbs and her wisdom and her sad knowing eyes. The doctor examined Elena in her chamber, while Gregor waited outside and Dracula, Elena knew, paced in his tower, unable to come closer, unable to help, driven nearly mad with worry. When the examination was complete, the doctor packed her herbs away and looked at Elena with sympathy that made her stomach clench with fear. "What is it?" Elena asked. "What is wrong with me?" The doctor was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "You have a wasting sickness," she said finally. "Your body is slowly failing, though I cannot say why. It is not plague or fever or any illness I know. It is as if," she hesitated, "as if you are being drained, though I see no wound, no visible cause." Elena's blood went cold. "Drained? Your vitality, your life force, it is being drawn away somehow," the doctor said. "I do not understand the mechanism, but the result is clear. Without intervention, without some way to restore what is being lost, you will continue to fade. Months, perhaps, a year at most." The words fell like hammer blows, each one driving home the terrible reality Elena had been trying to deny. She was dying, not in some distant theoretical future, but now, soon, too soon. "Is there anything you can do?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. "I can give you herbs to ease the symptoms, to make you more comfortable," the doctor said gently. "But cure you? No, child. This is beyond my skill. This is something else. Something I do not have words for." After the doctor left, after Gregor had settled Elena back into her bed with warm blankets and sympathetic whispers, after the castle had fallen into the deep silence of night, Elena finally allowed herself to cry, great, wrenching sobs that shook her weakened body and left her gasping for breath. She had always known her time was limited, but knowing it abstractly and facing it concretely were entirely different things. She was dying. In months, perhaps less, she would be gone, and Dracula would be left with exactly what he feared, the memory of her, the ghost of her voice in empty rooms, and the crushing weight of loss that would last forever. "Elena," his voice came from above, tight with barely controlled panic. "Elena, please talk to me. What did the doctor say?" She wanted to lie, to protect him, but she was too exhausted, too grief-stricken, too overwhelmed to maintain the pretense any longer. "I am dying," she said simply. "Some kind of wasting sickness. The doctor says months, maybe a year." The silence that followed was absolute. She could not hear him breathing, could not hear him moving. It was as if the entire castle had stopped, frozen in that moment of terrible revelation, then so quietly she almost missed it. "No, I am sorry," Elena said, tears streaming down her face. "I am so sorry, Dracula. I know this is your worst fear. I know you did not want— No, he said again, more forcefully this time. No, I will not accept this. There has to be something, some way to stop it, to cure you. The doctor said there is nothing, Elena interrupted gently. This is beyond mortal medicine, beyond any treatment she knows. Then I will find someone who does know, Dracula said, and now she heard desperation in his voice, raw and undisguised. There are healers in the East, mystics who understand arts forgotten by modern medicine. I will send Gregor to find them, to bring them here. And how long will that take? Elena asked softly. Weeks? Months? Dracula, I do not have that kind of time. We both know it. There has to be another way, he insisted, and she could hear him pacing now, furious, frantic. I will not simply watch you fade. I will not lose you like this. Helena, please, there has to be something. There is one thing, Elena said quietly. The pacing stopped. What? Elena took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what she was about to say. She had thought about this, in the dark hours of the night, in the moments when the weakness overtook her, and she felt death drawing closer. She had considered the possibility, weighed it against her mortality, and come to a decision that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Make me like you, she said. The silence that followed was even more absolute than before. No, Dracula said finally, and the word was flat, hard, absolute. Absolutely not. Elena, you do not know what you are asking. I do know, Elena insisted. I would become immortal like you. The sickness would stop. We would have not months but centuries together. We could— You would lose your soul, Dracula interrupted, his voice sharp with pain. You would lose your humanity, your warmth, everything that makes you who you are. You would become a creature of darkness, cursed to drink blood to survive, unable to see the sun, cut off from everything holy and good in this world. Elena, I would not wish this existence on my worst enemy, let alone on you. But I would be with you, Elena said. Is that not worth something? Not at such a cost, Dracula said firmly. I stole 9 years of your mortal life, Elena. I will not steal your immortal soul. I will not transform you into a monster like myself. You are not a monster, Elena said, frustration bleeding into her tone. How many times must I tell you that before you believe it? You are a man, cursed and broken, and trying desperately to be better than your nature. And if becoming like you means I can stay with you, means we can finally cross this distance that has kept us apart. The distance will remain, Dracula said, cutting her off. Even if I were to transform you, which I will not. The curse would still hold, my touch would still be poison. You would simply be immortal poison instead of mortal, suffering the same longing but forever instead of for a brief human lifetime. Nothing would change except you would lose everything that makes you human. Elena felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of frustration rather than grief. Then what do you suggest? That I simply fade away while you watch? That we spend my remaining months pretending this is not happening, maintaining this careful distance until the day comes when I simply do not wake up? Is that truly preferable? At least you would die human, Dracula said quietly. At least you would die with your soul intact, capable of whatever comes after death. Heaven, paradise, peace, whatever it is, you would be eligible for it. But if I transform you, you would lose that. You would be damned as I am damned, and I love you too much to allow that. The words hung in the air, the first time either of them had spoken that word directly, without euphemism or implication. I love you. Simple, direct, undeniable. And I love you, Elena said, her voice breaking on the words, which is why I am willing to risk damnation if it means staying with you, which is why I am willing to give up sunlight and mortality, and whatever awaits beyond death if it means we can have more time together. No, Dracula said, and now she heard tears in his voice too. No, Elena, I will not do it. I will not be the one who destroys you, not like this. Please do not ask me again. Elena lay in her bed, too weak to rise, too devastated to argue further. She had offered him everything, her mortality, her soul, her eternal future, and he had refused it, because he loved her, because he could not bear to curse her as he was cursed, and she understood, even through her grief and frustration, that this was who he was. The man who had watched over her for 9 years without touching her, who had maintained the distance even when it tortured him, who would rather lose her than harm her. She loved him for it even as it broke her heart. The days that followed were strange, suspended between acceptance and desperation. Helena's condition worsened steadily. She spent more time in bed, too weak to read, too tired to maintain long conversations. Dracula remained in his tower, close but distant, speaking to her when she had the energy, sitting vigil in silence when she did not. Gregor cared for her with patient devotion, bringing her water when she could not keep down food, reading to her from books when her eyes were too weak to focus on the pages themselves. And through it all, Elena felt time slipping through her fingers like sand, precious and impossible to hold. 2 weeks before what the doctor predicted would be the end, Elena asked Gregor to help her to the western courtyard one final time. She wanted to feel the sun on her face, to smell the spring flowers, to remember what the living world felt like before she left it. Gregor carried her, so light now she weighed almost nothing, and settled her in a chair near the fountain. The sun was warm, the breeze gentle, and Elena closed her eyes and breathed deep, committing the sensation to memory. She did not know that Dracula was watching from a darkened window, unable to join her in the sunlight, tormented by the sight of her frailty. She did not know that he had spent the past week searching desperately for alternatives, for any solution that would save her without damning her. She did not know that he was breaking apart inside, that 300 years of careful distance and controlled emotion were crumbling beneath the weight of losing her. That night, as Elena lay in her bed, drifting in and out of feverish sleep, she heard his voice calling to her, but it was different this time, not from above, from his tower, but from directly outside her door. "Elena," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Elena, may I come in?" She struggled to consciousness, confused. In 9 years he had never entered her chamber. The distance had always been maintained. Why now, when she was too weak to even sit up, too sick to appreciate the significance of his presence? "Yes," she managed to whisper. "Please." The door opened and Dracula entered her chamber for the first time. He moved slowly, carefully, staying near the wall, as far from her bed as the room would allow. But he was there, in the same space, close enough that she could see him clearly without straining. He was beautiful and terrible, pale as moonlight, with eyes that held centuries of sorrow and something else, something desperate and determined. "I have been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you asked, about transformation." Elena's heart began to race, hope and fear warring within her weak body. "You said no. You said you would not damn me." "I did say that," Dracula agreed, "and I meant it. But Elena, I have also been considering the alternative. Watching you die, losing you forever, spending eternity with nothing but the memory of your voice. And I find that I am not as strong as I believed. I find that I am selfish after all." "What are you saying?" Elena asked, hardly daring to hope. Dracula closed his eyes, his hands clenched at his sides. "I am saying that if you still want it, if you truly understand the cost and still choose it willingly, I will transform you. Not because I believe it is right, not because I think it is what is best for you, but because I am too weak to watch you die, too selfish to let you go, too broken to face another 300 years alone." Tears streamed down Elena's face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, please. I want it. I want to stay with you. I want time, even if it means giving up the sun, even if it means damnation. I want you." Dracula's expression twisted with pain and relief and desperate love. "Then I will do it," he said. "But Elena, you must understand, even after transformation, I still will not be able to touch you. The curse remains. You will be immortal, yes, but the distance between us will still exist. We will still be separated. Does that change your choice?" "No," Elena said firmly. "I told you before, I would rather have centuries at a distance with you than a single moment of closeness with anyone else. Transform me, Dracula. Make me like you. Give us time." He nodded slowly, then moved to the window and drew the heavy curtains closed, plunging the room into darkness broken only by candlelight. "It will hurt," he warned. "The transformation. I will drain you to the point of death, and then you will drink my blood. It will feel like burning from the inside out, like dying and being reborn simultaneously. Can you endure that?" "I can endure anything if it means staying with you," Elena said. Dracula moved closer to the bed, but still did not touch her. "I cannot bite you directly," he said. "My mouth to your throat. That would be touch and the curse would activate. But I can draw blood from a distance, using my power. And you can drink from a cup I fill for you. It will work, though it will be more difficult, more painful than the traditional way." "I do not care," Elena said. "Please, do it now before I am too weak, before it is too late." Dracula raised his hand, and Elena felt a strange, pulling sensation in her chest, as if something inside her was being drawn toward him. She gasped as the sensation intensified, as her blood began to flow from her body without any visible wound, pulled by his supernatural power toward his outstretched palm, where it gathered in a floating sphere of dark crimson. The pain was intense but bearable, and Elena watched with fascinated horror as her life force left her body, as she felt herself growing weaker, colder, closer to death with each passing second. "Enough," Dracula said finally, and the pulling stopped. He moved to her writing desk and retrieved a silver cup, then let the floating sphere of blood drain away into nothing, wasted, before turning his attention to his own wrist. He bit into his pale flesh without hesitation, and dark blood, darker than hers, almost black, welled from the wound. He held his wrist over the cup and let it fill, then brought the cup to Elena's bedside, setting it carefully on the table within her reach. "Drink," he commanded. "Drink all of it quickly before your heart stops completely." Elena's hands shook as she lifted the cup to her lips. The blood was cold and tasted of metal and darkness, and something ancient and powerful. She forced herself to swallow despite her body's instinctive revulsion, drinking deeply until the cup was empty. For a moment, nothing happened. Elena set the cup aside and lay back against her pillows, wondering if it had worked, if the transformation would take hold, or if she would simply die as she had been dying anyway. Then the pain began. It started in her chest, a burning sensation that quickly spread through her entire body. Elena gasped, then screamed as her nerves caught fire, as every cell in her body began to tear apart and rebuild itself into something new, something other, something not quite human anymore. Dracula stood beside her bed, his face twisted with anguish, unable to touch her, unable to comfort her, forced to watch as she convulsed with agony. "I am sorry," he whispered over and over. "I am so sorry, Elena. Please forgive me. Please survive this." The pain intensified, became unbearable, and Elena's screams filled the castle, echoing off ancient stones that had witnessed too much suffering already. She felt her heart stutter and stop, felt her lungs seize, felt death claim her completely. And then, slowly, impossibly, she felt something new begin. A heartbeat, slower than before, stronger, powered not by mortal life, but by dark magic older than civilization. Lungs that expanded, though she no longer needed air in the same way. Senses that sharpened until she could hear every sound in the castle, could see perfectly in the darkness, could smell blood from rooms away. The pain receded, replaced by an otherworldly clarity, a sense of power and strength she had never imagined possible. Elena opened her eyes that now saw in the darkness as clearly as mortal eyes saw in sunlight, and looked at Dracula. He was crying, tears of relief and grief streaming down his pale face. "You survived," he said, his voice breaking. "You survived the transformation. You are like me now, immortal, cursed, damned." "No," Elena said, and her voice was different now, stronger, carrying undertones that had not been there before. "Not damned, changed, but still myself, still here, still with you." She sat up in bed, feeling the new strength in her body, the absence of weakness that had plagued her for months. She was no longer dying. She was no longer mortal. She was something else, something eternal, something that would not fade with time. "How do you feel?" Dracula asked carefully, still maintaining his distance, even though she was no longer fragile human, but immortal vampire. "Powerful," Elena admitted. "Strange, different, but..." She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing him with new eyes that perceived things she had never noticed before, the aura of ancient power around him, the way his supernatural nature hummed in the air, the depth of emotion in his inhuman eyes. "But still myself, still Elena, still in love with you." Dracula's expression softened with relief, but the sorrow remained. "You can never see the sun again," he said quietly, "never feel its warmth, never walk in daylight. You will have to drink blood to survive, will have to take life to maintain your own existence. And the distance, Elena, the distance still remains. I still cannot touch you. The curse was not broken by your transformation." "I know," Elena said. "You warned me, I accepted it anyway. And I do not regret it, Dracula, not for a moment." She rose from the bed, finding her legs steady and strong, and moved to stand near him. Not touching, they were still careful, still aware of the danger, but closer than they had been in 9 years. Close enough that she could have reached out and taken his hand if she dared. But she did not dare, because he was right. The curse remained. Touch would still be poison, even between two immortals. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Dracula said, and for the first time in 300 years there was something like hope in his voice. "Now we have time, centuries of it, millennia perhaps, to talk, to learn, to exist together even if we cannot touch, to find whatever joy can be found in this cursed existence. Together." "Together," Elena agreed, smiling despite everything, despite the loss of her humanity and her soul, and her chance at whatever came after mortal death. "But Dracula—" "Yes, I still want to touch you," she admitted, "even knowing it is impossible, even knowing it will always be impossible. I will spend every night of our eternity wanting what I cannot have." "As will I," Dracula said softly. "But perhaps that is what love is, Elena. Not the having, but the wanting. Not the touching, but the longing. Not the fulfillment, but the eternal aching for something just beyond reach." They stood there in the darkness, two immortal beings separated by mere inches, but unable to bridge the gap, and they both understood that this was their fate now. This was their eternity. To be together but apart, to love but never hold, to exist in each other's presence, while maintaining the careful distance that kept them both safe. It was not the happy ending that mortal tales promised. It was not the resolution of all conflicts, the triumphant overcoming of all obstacles, but it was theirs, this strange, impossible, beautiful tragedy, this love that defied nature and logic and every reasonable expectation. Months passed, years. Elena adjusted to her new existence, as Dracula had centuries before, learning to hunt without guilt, to embrace the darkness, to find meaning in an immortal life. And through it all, she and Dracula maintained their routine of careful distance and constant companionship. They were together. They were in love. They were happy, in the way that cursed beings could be happy, and they never touched. Not once in all the years that followed did they risk the contact that might destroy them both. They remained separated by that final unbridgeable distance, by the curse that had defined Dracula's existence for 3 centuries, and would define Elena's for however many centuries lay ahead. But late one night, exactly 50 years after Elena's transformation, as they stood in the courtyard under stars that had witnessed their entire strange courtship, Elena made a decision. "I want to try something," she said. Dracula looked at her warily. "What?" "I want to test the curse," Elena said. "After 50 years as a vampire, after all this time existing as you exist, I wonder if perhaps the curse affects me differently than it would have affected mortal me." "Absolutely not," Dracula said immediately. "Elena, we have been fortunate. We have had 50 years together, 50 years of companionship. Do not risk it now." 50 years, Elena repeated. "And in all that time, I have not touched you once. Not a brush of fingers, not an accidental contact, nothing. Dracula, I am going mad with wanting. Please, just let me try. If it begins to hurt, if the curse activates, I will pull away immediately. But I need to know. I need to know if there is any possibility, any hope at all." Dracula's expression was torn between desire and terror. "And if it destroys you, then it destroys me," Elena said simply. "But I would rather die having touched you once than live forever without even trying." For a long moment Dracula said nothing, his ancient eyes searching hers. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "One touch," he said. "One moment, and at the first sign of pain, you pull away. Promise me." "I promise," Elena said, her heart, such as it was now, pounding with anticipation and fear. They stood facing each other in the moonlight, and slowly, carefully, Elena raised her hand. Dracula raised his as well, and for the first time in 50 years of their immortal companionship, in 9 years before that of mortal captivity, their fingertips moved toward each other, across the unbridgeable distance. Elena's fingers touched his, and the world held its breath. No burning, no poison, no curse activating to destroy them both. Just touch. Simple, ordinary, miraculous touch. The feel of his skin against hers. Cold but real. Solid but gentle. Proof that they existed, that they were both here, that after all this time, all this waiting, all this aching, they could finally cross the distance that had kept them apart. Elena gasped, tears streaming down her face. "It does not hurt," she whispered in wonder. "Dracula, it does not hurt." Dracula stared at their joined hands with an expression of such profound shock and joy and disbelief that Elena laughed through her tears. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid the slightest wrong movement would break the spell, He intertwined his fingers with hers. Still no pain, still no curse, just contact, blessed and miraculous, after 3 centuries of enforced isolation. "I do not understand," Dracula said, his voice shaking. "The curse was absolute. It killed Elisabetta. It should kill you." "Why?" "Perhaps," Elena said softly, "because I am no longer mortal. Perhaps because I am like you now, undead, transformed. Perhaps the curse only affects the living, and the dead cannot be harmed by it. Or perhaps," Dracula said slowly, as understanding dawned in his ancient eyes, "the curse was never as absolute as I believed. Perhaps it was tied to my guilt, my belief that I deserved isolation, my conviction that I would destroy anyone I touched. And perhaps, after 50 years of learning to live differently, of being loved by you, of beginning to forgive myself, perhaps I am not as cursed as I once was." They stood there, hands joined, both crying, both laughing, both overwhelmed by the simple, extraordinary miracle of touch after so long without it. And then, slowly, Dracula raised his free hand to Elena's face, cupping her cheek with infinite gentleness, as if she were the most precious and fragile thing in existence. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Elena breathed. "Please, yes." And after 9 years of watching from a distance, after 50 years of careful separation, after 3 centuries of cursed isolation, Count Dracula finally crossed the last space between them and kissed the woman he loved. The kiss was tender and desperate and full of all the longing they had carried for decades. It was an apology and a promise and a celebration all at once. It was everything they had wanted and more than they had dared to hope for. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through their tears, their hands still joined, unwilling to break the contact even for a moment. "I love you," Dracula said, speaking the words with his lips instead of across stone and shadow for the first time. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you in your wedding dress, and I will love you for all of eternity." "And I love you," Elena replied, "through all the years behind us and all the years ahead. Through the distance and now through the closeness, forever." They stood in the courtyard of Castle Dracula, 2 immortal beings no longer cursed to isolation, no longer separated by the distance that had defined their entire relationship. They stood together, touching, holding each other, and for the first time in either of their long existences, they were complete. The curse was broken, not by magic or ritual, but by time and love, and the slow, painful work of learning to forgive oneself. The distance that had seemed eternal had finally been crossed, and what lay beyond it was worth every moment of longing, every night of aching, every year of patient waiting. They had eternity ahead of them now, eternity to make up for lost time, to explore this new closeness, to discover what love could be when it was no longer confined to words and distance. But they would never forget those 9 years, those 50 years, that time when they had learned to love without touching, to be intimate without contact, to build something profound out of longing and separation. Because it was that distance that had taught them the value of closeness. It was that curse that had made them appreciate the miracle of touch. It was that impossible separation that had forged their love into something strong enough to last forever. In the village below, Father Constantine, now an old man, his hair white, his body bent with age, looked up at the castle silhouetted against the mountains and said a prayer. Not a prayer of binding or destruction, but a prayer of gratitude. Because he had learned that night 50 years ago when he walked away from his crusade that love could exist in the darkest places, that monsters could learn to be human again, and that redemption was possible even for the damned. He had been wrong about so many things, but he had been right about one thing. Elena Vaduva had died that night. The woman she had been, the mortal bride stolen from her wedding, had ceased to exist. In her place was something else, something eternal. Something that had chosen damnation over separation, had embraced darkness to stay with the one she loved, and had found in that choice not corruption, but completion. The priest smiled, despite the sadness of his realization, and returned to his church to pray for souls he no longer believed needed saving. In the castle, Dracula and Elena stood together, hands joined, the distance, finally, miraculously crossed, and they began their true eternity. Not as prisoner and captor, not as monster and victim, but as 2 beings who had learned to love through separation and would now learn to love through closeness, carrying with them always the memory of that beautiful, terrible distance that had made them who they were. Their story was not a tragedy, though it contained tragedy. It was not a romance, though it was full of love. It was something else entirely, something dark and beautiful and strange, something that defied easy categorization or simple morality. It was the story of the distance between them, and how in the end love found a way to bridge it, and they lived, if such a word could apply to the undead, happily ever after, in their own impossible way, forever.